Well, hello everybody, it's Gerald here and I will be your genial host throughout the duration of this tutorial. And in this tutorial video I plan on setting out to try and demist the hist. That is to say, to demystify the goings on of the histogram. And if you are a complete beginner to DSLR photography, you may be even at a more intermediate level, this may be of use to you because you may have seen them, you may have heard of them, but you just really don't have much of a clue as what they are and how to best use them. Now, one of the magical things that digital photography gives us is the ability to review an image instantly on the back of our cameras, or the inside of an electronic viewfinder, or in a photo editor. Frequently, one possible mistake that we make as beginners is when reviewing an image on our cameras, we evaluate exposure based purely on the image we're seeing after the shot has been taken on the back of the camera's LCD screen. So why might this be a mistake? Well, both your camera's LCD and electronic viewfinder likely have adjustable brightness, which can greatly affect the appearance of the brightness and or darkness of the resulting shot. Also, you might be viewing your images in bright sunlight and having to deal with a lot of reflective glare coming off the LCD screen, or in very low light situations where the resulting image may appear on the screen to be a lot brighter than it really is. All these factors can work together to fool the eye when it comes to evaluating the true exposure values of an image. So this is where your friend the histogram can come to the rescue. I say friend because, as all good friends should do, it never lies to you and will always show you an accurate display of the overall exposure value and color balance of the shot you've just taken or are about to take. So what is a histogram then? Basically, a histogram is a mathematical algorithm that creates a graphical representation of the dynamic range of any given image. That is to say, the overall darkness and brightness values within the image. Moving from left to right, it is divided into three main areas. On the left, the shadows and darks of an image. At the center, the midtone values. And on the right, the lights, whites and highlights of the image. Now, each of these points are given numeric values. On the left, 0 equals solid black. On the far right, 255 equals solid white. And right in the middle, in the midtones, it's 127, which is obviously half of 255, thereabouts. Now in Lightroom, these values are given as percentages. So 0% equals solid black, 100% equals solid white, and 50% equals midtones. So that's all well and good, but where can we find this friend and how do we use it? Your histogram can be found in camera and in your respective image editing software, albeit Lightroom or Photoshop, etc, etc. If you are shooting in live view, you will most likely be able to have it on screen as you are setting up to take the shot, as can be seen here, which will give you an instant reference as to how you are doing it in regards to the overall exposure of the imminent shot. Alternatively, you may be able to configure your rear view screen to display the image you just shot along with its respective histogram, as can also be seen here, which I'm personally a big fan of. Now, what we are seeing here is the RGB histogram, which is always displayed as white. And this is a combination of all three RGB channels, red, green and blue, to display just the exposure values within the image. It doesn't give us any indication as to the color balance of the image. If this is something we also want to be able to see, it may be possible to further customize the screen by displaying the histogram in expanded view that also shows the respective histograms for each of the color channels as well. These can be useful to indicate whether you may have noticeable color cast in the shot. For example, if the blue channel was showing a lot of the data pushed over to the right, that could indicate that there may be a very strong presence of a blue color cast throughout the image, and this is something you might want to address in camera by altering a white balance or in post-production. Basically, what you are looking for is a good spread of the data across the horizontal axis from left to right, from your darks and shadows through the midtones and into the brights and highlights of the shot, as can be seen here. Now let's take a look at this shot and take a look at its respective histogram. As you can see, virtually all the data is crammed over to the left and there is virtually nothing over to the right in the lights area. All the darks are squashed and crushed against the left side, indicating that most of the shadow information is at 0, meaning solid black. All these factors combined immediately tell us that this image is very underexposed. Well, you may be thinking pretty obvious, but no, not really, as if you remember earlier I mentioned that it can be difficult to make these evaluations given that your LCD screen on the back may be set to very bright, which could trick you into thinking that this shot looks okay, and also the ambient light. As I said before, bright sunlight would make it very difficult to make an accurate evaluation of the shot's exposure, which is why it's very important to use the histogram to give an accurate reading, either if shooting in live view or when reviewing the shot on the back of the camera. So in this case, given that you see that the histogram is telling us that this shot is way underexposed, you can then set about changing your camera settings accordingly. So in this case, you would need to let more light into the camera, either by reducing your shutter speed and going for a longer exposure, or opening up your aperture to allow more light in, or a combination of the two. Then take another shot and review the resulting shot and histogram. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, let's take a look at this shot, and yes, just by quickly looking at its histogram, you can see now all the data is shunted and jammed over to the right this time, in the whites, brights and highlights, with a big vertical spike indicating that many of the brights and probably all of the highlights are clipping. That is to say, they are blown out and at 255, which, as you will remember, is solid white. Also, the black point on the left is way off the left-hand edge. All this information is telling us that obviously this shot is way overexposed. And like before, you will now need to do the opposite. That is to say, reduce the amount of light coming into the camera, either by increasing your shutter speed to a much shorter exposure time, or closing down your aperture to reduce the amount of light entering through the lens, or like before, a combination of the two. So let's now take a look at this next shot, which is starting to get a little bit more like it. As you can see from the histogram, there is a more even and consistent spread of the information from the darks through the midtones to the lights. There is nothing being jammed over to the left or right, and in particular no highlight clipping spike on the right. Given that this was taken at first light, we can see from the histogram it's a little on the dark side, which may be expected, but that's okay. This is something that can be easily and quickly adjusted in post-production if necessary, either in Lightroom or Photoshop, or the photo editing software of your choice. Straight out of camera, by using the histogram for exposure evaluation, one can be confident one has a fairly decent exposure to begin with before starting any further adjustments in post. Thus far, we have been looking at how to use the Rgb histogram to evaluate exposure based on the dark and light values within an image. But if you recall this earlier example, I showed a histogram in expanded view to reveal the red, green and blue channel histograms as well. In this next section, we will now head into Photoshop to see how these can be used for color correction as well as overall exposure within an image. Now, I'll be the first to admit that this does get a little bit technical, but fear not, just follow along and it's pretty straightforward. Well, here we are in Photoshop, and as you can see, this is the image I'm going to be using for this demonstration. It's the one we've been looking at all along. And I have a few panels up here for my use. I have my layers panel, I have my properties panel, I have my histogram panel, not surprisingly, and my info panel. Now, if you're new to Photoshop, all your panels can be found by coming up under Window and using the drop-down menu to select whichever ones it is you want to use. So, right, this part of the tutorial is looking at how we can use the red, green and blue color channels to possibly make any color corrections we feel are necessary to the shot. Now, in order to do that, to have them on display, I just need to come up here under this drop-down menu on the right and select switch over from expanded view to all channels view. Now, by default, these all come up as white, and you know, if it's the first time you're using them, you may want a slightly better visual cue of what you're looking at is just simply to come back up and then select show channels in color. So there we are, our more familiar red, green and blue. So let's take a look at these histograms and see what's going on. If I start looking at my red channel here, I can see a fairly good even spread, but if I start looking at this line, the highlight line here, you can see it's right on the edge of the histogram here, which is indicating to me that that's kind of right on the cusp, probably around about 255, so it's pretty close to clipping. But if I look here at the green channel, you can see there's a little bit of headroom here. There's a little bit of space between the end of the line here and the edge of the histogram. But if I look at the blue channel, you can see there is actually quite a big discrepancy here in terms of right at the edge here, there is a big space between it. So this is now telling me that I probably do have a kind of and I think you can see it here, there's this kind of like slightly pink mauvish tinge or cast to the image. Now what I'm going to do now is correct this by adding a couple of control points to this image and using them in conjunction with a curves adjustment layer. But before I add them, I need to find the absolute darkest and brightest points within the image. And to do that, I'm going to come over to the bottom of my layers panel to the little 1/2 cookie icon, click and add a threshold adjustment layer. This is a very simple but very useful tool, as all it does is represent dark and light as solid values, i.e. solid white and solid black. To find my darkest point, I'm going to click on its slider and drag it all the way over to the left. And as you can see, the screen goes completely white. Well, this is a good sign, as it's telling me right now in this image I have no shadows or darks that are at absolute zero, i.e. solid black. But to find my darkest spot, I'm now going to slowly drag the slider back over to the right and carefully watch to see when the black starts to appear. At this juncture, it's just down to trying to see and figure out which black area is appearing first. I think it's right down about here. So I'm now going to tap my Z key to select my zoom tool and zoom in to confirm that. Now what I'll do is tap the I key on my keyboard to bring up the eyedropper tool and hover over that darkest spot. But before I click, I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and when I do, you will see a very small crosshair icon appear. Now when I click, it's added a control point to that darkest area. So now I've just added control point number 1. Now what I will do is the exact same thing to find and target the brightest point. I'll just press Command or Control 0 to zoom out. Now I'll grab the threshold slider and bring it all the way over to the right, and this time the screen goes to solid black, which again is good news, as this is telling me as of now I have no highlights that are already clipping. So I'll now begin to drag this slider slowly over to the left and see where the white starts to reveal itself, which I'm sure is going to be on that small break in the clouds where the sun was starting to shine through. And yes, there it is. So I'll just tap Z on my keyboard again, zoom in, and then tap the I key to bring up the eyedropper, hover over that white spot, hold down the Shift key, click, and the second control point for the highlights has now been created. Now Command or Control 0 to zoom out. Now the job of the threshold layer is now done, and I can either toggle off its visibility or just simply delete it, which is what I'm going to do. So now let's switch our attention to the info panel and see what those control points are telling us. On control point number 1, my darks is telling me that the red channel has a numeric value of 1, the same for the green, and the blue channel has a value of 2. Now remembering that 0 is solid black, these numbers are telling me I'm very close to that and will need to make some adjustments to bring up those darks and shadow areas. If we now look at the second control point, my highlights, the red channel is at 255, which is what I suspected by looking at its histogram. My green channel is at 242, which is good as it gives me a nice buffer up to 255. But when looking at the blue channel's value, it's way down at 225. So my goal will be to increase its value up to 242 to match the green channel. But now all this information is now confirming that I do indeed have a pinkish red color cast on the image, and this is something I may wish to correct. To do that, I'll come over to the bottom of my layers panel and add a curves adjustment layer. By default, it will come up displaying the composite RGB histogram. I now want to switch this over by clicking on the dialog box and selecting my red channel. So my goal is to reduce the amount of red in the image by bringing its numeric value down to 242 to match my green channel. There are a number of ways one can move these points, either just by dragging down to reduce the red or dragging it over to the left to increase the red. One of the other ways to do this and be more incrementally accurate is to use your up, down, right and left arrow keys on your keyboard, which is what I'm going to do. So with that point selected, I'm just going to start tapping on my down arrow on the keyboard. And when I do, you'll begin to see the number on the info panel start to decrease. And I'll continue tapping until it reaches 242 to match the green channel. And there we are. Now what I'm going to do is switch over to the blue channel. No need to worry about the green as it's already where I want it to be. And with the bright point selected top right, I'm now going to start tapping my left arrow key to move it to the left, thus increasing the blue value. If we now reference the info panel, we will see as I do, the numeric values start to increase, and my goal is to bring them up to 242 to match the red and the green channels. Okay, with all channels set to 242 now, let's toggle on and off the curves adjustment layer and see what happens. Now, as you can see, by doing that, it has removed that pinkish mauve color cast, and it's now a lot closer to what I was seeing standing there freezing to death taking the shot. Now let's focus our attention on the darks, which you will remember were very close to 0 and solid black. At this juncture, I want to bring their values up to around maybe between 10 or 12 across all channels. To do that, I'm going to return to my curves panel and reselect my reds channel, and this time clicking on the node at the bottom left. And with it selected, start tapping on my up arrow so the numeric value on the darks control point begin to rise, and I will bring it up to 12. With that done, I will now do the same for both the green and blue channels so that all three channels have a numeric value of 12. So now let's go back and once again toggle on and off this curves layer and see what that's done. It's definitely reduced the black in the shadows and brought back quite a bit more detail. But overall, one could say that the image appears to be a little on the flat side. But at this juncture, I'm fine with that, as I now know that I have some headroom both in my highlights and dark areas as I move forward with further development such as contrast and or color adjustments. And just like we discussed earlier when evaluating exposure and histograms in camera, some of the same factors may apply when editing one shot in post that may make it a little bit tricky to make an accurate evaluation. And that may be the ambient light in the room, whether you're trying to be a bit more forgiving on the old peepers and have your screen brightness quite low. But there is also another important factor more unique to post-processing on your computer, and that's also your screen's color calibration. By way of example, let me go up to my system preferences and click on displays. Then click on color, and you can see there are a whole bunch of different color spaces and color calibration presets I can choose from. Right now I have my screen set to a custom calibration which was created using an XRite color Munki, which has proved to be extremely valuable in calibrating my screen very accurately in terms of both tonal contrast and color accuracy as well. And this is something you may want to consider getting, and I'll put a link to their site in the show notes if you wish to go and investigate further. But let's just take a look when I switch over to the default iMac calibration. Now you'll see there's quite a big difference both tonally and in the overall color temperature. But if we now switch back to Photoshop, we can see that, like in camera, none of these factors will affect the readings you'll be seeing from the histograms and or the numeric number values. So now let's switch away from the more technical to the more philosophical. I just want to stress that this approach is just something I do at the start of processing an image to get into a more balanced zone to move forward with my post-processing workflow. In short, don't think you have to be a slave to these histograms and or numbers, because I can tell you there have been many times where I've gone through this process and toggled on the curves adjustment layer only to decide, you know what, I think I prefer it as it was. I like that pinkish color cast as I think it brings a bit of warmth into the shot. This begins to touch on what is inherently unique about photography. It's a two-sided coin. On the one side, it's technicalities, and on the other side is your own creative vision, which to you is very personal, but to anyone else, purely subjective. For example, you may want to be driven by the aesthetic of a particular genre of shot, such as like here, a high contrast chiaroscuro or black and white image, where the inherent aesthetic is to have very dark rich blacks juxtaposed against very bright whites. And if we take a look at its histogram, you can see everything I've been saying about not letting your histogram slam over to either the left or the right. Well, in terms of the darks on the left, well, that completely went out the window. But I decided that in the overall aesthetic of this particular shot, it was fine. Well, at least my highlights weren't clipping. These are the kind of judgment calls you will need to make and probably should make as you progress as a photographer. But there may be times when something like this may become more important. Say, for example, if you're thinking about getting into portraiture, where the need to color correct in order to create natural looking skin tones may be necessary. And let's just hold on this shot so I can make another important point. If you look at its histogram, you'll notice I do have a small clipping spike on the far right. There's always usually natural highlights to be found in an image, but there are also what's known as specular highlights. These are the very bright points of light bouncing off reflective surfaces such as metals, glass, water, and maybe jewellery. Or as you can see in this shot, background lights like the candles and the table lamp, or in the reflections coming off her glasses. Again, it will really come down to your own judgments to decide if they are too much and need to be corrected. Or in the case of this shot, I decided they weren't interfering with the overall aesthetic and let them be regardless of what the histogram was telling me. But where I think this will become important is if you do decide to get into something like product photography, where accurate colour representation of brand colours and or product colours will be very important to both your client and their prospective customers, particularly if they're buying online and only have the image to go by. Also important, bearing in mind that your images aren't probably going to be just tucked away on your computer for only you to see. You'll probably want to share them either as prints or share them with the world on photography and social media websites. Regardless, having the ability to accurately assess your image's exposure, tonal contrast, and or colour balance using histograms will be very valuable to you over time as you progress and develop as a photographer. So now for the good news. Yes, I'm done. So thanks very much for watching. I hope you found some food for thought, and as always, if you have any further questions, feel free to drop me an email or just leave a comment below, but I would appreciate ones that are safe for work. Okay, signing off. Bye for now.